gave me an official slate because I fell again on Monday.
Alright, welcome to Episcopal 101.2. Alright, well we're going to begin with a prayer. So if you would like to pray with me, today is the Feast of St. Joseph. And in the city where I'm from, New Orleans, St. Joseph's Day is a huge holiday, particularly in the Roman Catholic community. But St. Joseph is a saint in the Anglican Church as well. So pray with me. O God, you raised up your servant Joseph to be the guardian of your son Jesus and the spouse of his mother Mary. Give us grace to imitate his uprightness of life and his obedience to your commands. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever.
Amen.
So welcome. I am Amelia Arthur. I'm a second-year seminarian at Luther, and I feel like I know some people in this room. But for those of you who I don't know yet, St. Mark's is my sponsoring parish for ordination, so I'm yours. And it's always fun to be here and do something on Sunday morning. I thought that since this is Episcopal 101 and we're gathered as a group of newcomers as well as a group of people who might have been part of St. Mark's for a long time, it might be nice to just go around and at least have people just say their name. You don't have to say anything else unless you want to. But the other thing I would love to do is invite anyone who's participating in our conversation who might be sitting in the back, particularly those back few tables. You're welcome to move forward if you want to feel like you're sort of in this conversation. If not, that's totally okay too. But if we can maybe start right over here, would you just say your first and last name, give a little wave?
I'm Jane Deidre.
I'm Jeremiah. That's my wife, Dusty. We've been coming since the first Sunday back.
Welcome to everyone who's here. Today we're talking about Episcopal or Anglican ethos and temperament. And so I'll present for a few minutes and then we will get to discuss any parts of this that you might want to discuss. And if you don't want to discuss that, we might discuss other things. But to start off with, I intentionally wrote Anglican because I think that one of the things that we do when we use the term Episcopal is we kind of limit ourselves geographically to our sort of national borders. The Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America is the full title of the church that we as Episcopalians in Minnesota are a part of. And we are one branch of what our presiding bishop calls the Jesus movement, but what's also known as the Anglican Church throughout the world. That might be refresher information for most of you, but if it's not, it might give you a geographic framework. So there are churches affiliated with the Anglican Communion on all of the continents that are permanently inhabited, as well as a chapel at the Antarctic Research Station. So the Anglican Church really is a worldwide communion. And so I think that it's significant that when we talk about ethos or temperament, that we know that we're talking about some general characteristics of people who identify themselves as Anglican Christians in all corners of the world. And we could say a lot about the history of the Anglican Church and the way that it has spread throughout the globe. But that's, I think, another discussion. But I did just want to point that out, that's why I'm going to use the term Anglican, because you might find that some of the specific pieces of our ethos or temperament are shared with Anglicans that you might meet from Africa, from South America, from Europe, et cetera, from India. And so just to keep that in mind, I kind of love it that we're a worldwide communion. in that way. So the first thing that I think is important when we talk about ethos or temperament is to say that Anglicans believe that truth can be found in exploring the creative tension between opposites. So to me, that's a foundational piece of who we are as Anglicans. You might have heard of the via media, this idea of the middle way, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But Anglicans can affirm both the sacred and the secular, the material and the spiritual, the mind and the heart, glory and intimacy, knowledge and mystery. So we are at our core a people who live holding extremes in balance. And that's reflected in the way that we worship. That's reflected, I think, in the makeup of who is in our congregations. You might have noticed, whether you are fairly new or a long-term member, that most Episcopal churches that you walk into have people that run the gamut of any division that you could see in society. And somehow we figure out a way to meet together and have some things in common and work from there as we're in relationship. So the first thing that I'd like to touch on is this idea of moderation, or the via media. So, like I said, Anglicans avoid extremes. They believe that a godly life, and we don't, that's an old kind of term to use, but that a godly life is both inwardly graceful and ordered, and outwardly serving the world and responsible for oneself and one's neighbors. We are in theology, in our liturgy, in our ministry, a middle way between Roman Catholicism and Reformed Protestantism. And we are, in fact, the only denominational church that can really claim that middle path between those two. So the second piece is that we are open-minded. And the other word that I have when I think about that is intellectual. Anglicans believe in good scholarship. Recently I read an article from, I think it was Insider Business or maybe US News and World Report, but the 50, it named the best private high school in every state in the United States, and like 33 of them were Episcopal schools. So Anglicans are really, really good at education. We, I think, follow in the tradition of the Jesuits and the Benedictines, groups that had a presence in England before England split from the Roman Catholic Church. And I think we've kept that as a part of our ethos. So we believe in good scholarship, and we believe in going back to the original sources, valuing and questioning our faith, and learning from those questions as much as we might learn from the knowledge that we already have. So we search for wisdom in many cases, and we encourage people to listen to one another and to bring their honest questions from their life journey and their relationships to the table when we have discussions. So part of our polity is that we are okay with the tension that sort of thing can bring. It's a lot easier if we say, this is the one thing you have to believe, and everyone has to believe it, and you can take it or leave it. That can be an easier path, and we choose to not do that. We choose to say there are many, many ways that you can believe, or many things you can think, and we're willing to come to the table and be in relationship around that. And that's one of the reasons I really love the Anglican Church. It means that we might quarrel a bit amongst ourselves. It might mean that sometimes the container gets really, really shaky, but that in the end that container doesn't break. So moving down to this idea of ambiguity or mystery, this is a little bit like the idea of moderation or that middle way, but Anglicans really do tend to not be black and white in our thinking. We affirm the ambiguity of personal experience and the breadth of human life, and the inherent nuance and complexity of everything that happens within the creation. So we really believe as Anglicans that life is complex, that life is ordered, and we willingly accept that we cannot know or explain everything that happens to us or that happens in the world. So I love this idea that we believe in as as much in the mystery as we do in knowledge. I'm going to have to hold all of this. All right, so intuitive. Anglicans are absolutely at home, at home in the world of poetry, imagery, symbolism, storytelling, ritual, and art. We love the things that are lovely. Although we've always resisted the temptation to align ourselves with the strict dogma of any wing of the Church Universal. And so that's a kind of complicated way of saying, that we haven't wanted to align ourselves completely with the symbology or ritual of the Roman Catholic Church, nor with the lack of that in the truly Reformed Protestant denominations. But we have had a great many theologians who have lived into this middle way and who have done so in a way where they value these beautiful things that are made and produced and pleasing to us in the world. So we've found a way of valuing things that some people might say are secular, and we might call them those sacred because of the way that they inform our experience of beauty or of God manifest in the spirit of life. One story that I think is, or not story, but historical example that I think is a great example of that is our Book of Common Prayer and Shakespeare. So the Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer from England, the early one, as well as the works of Shakespeare are the two documents that have, in the English language, influenced the most popular sayings. So many of our sayings either can be traced back to Shakespeare, or when we think of more religious or theological language, so many of our terms or sentences or phrases actually are traced back to our prayer book. So all of the Protestant denominations that have prayer books loosely based theirs on ours. But there's something beautiful, I think, about the language in our prayer book, about the art that you see in our cathedrals, about the way that we are okay with icons as a lens through which to view holiness. That corresponds very much with this idea of aesthetics, so it's sort of repetitive, but we believe that beauty in all its fullness is the doorway to truth, to goodness, and ultimately to God. So then, our last two, naturalistic. So perhaps it's because of our Celtic origins, but Anglicans have a reverence for nature and the inherent rhythms in nature. We believe absolutely that we are not above the created order, but are very much part of its delicate and intricate balance. Anglicans see themselves first and foremost as stewards of creation rather than those who have been given dominance over creation. And I think particularly in this day and age, that difference is really, really important. It informs how we think about the world that surrounds us. It informs how we live in that world and the things that we choose to do to that world and the creatures in it. So finally, in terms of politics, this is probably the shortest thing I'm going to say, but Anglicans believe that the Christian life is inherently political, that our life together as Christians has political implications, and that engagement in civic life is both a legitimate and an important role for who we are and how we express our faith. So, I apologize that I didn't think about putting all of these terms on one page, but those are the basic terms that I use to describe who we are as Anglicans and how we function. So I'd love to turn this into a conversation where we can really be with one another. Is there anything from any of that that stands out for you, that you have questions about, that you want to add something to or talk more about? Yeah?
If you take naturalistic, is it possible, so for example, the American Indian Native people I know in Vermont believe that nature is God. So if you just believe that one aspect, could you be an Episcopalian?
You mean if you believe it the way the Native Americans in Vermont believe
Yes.
it? Well, that's actually a really great question. I'm going to repeat it just to make sure that everyone over here could hear what was asked. But so, example of the Native Americans in Vermont believing that nature is actually God. And so if you just take this one piece of our ethos, could you still be an Episcopalian? I mean, I think you can practice as an Episcopalian, having a variety of beliefs. But what I would say is that the line that we would draw theologically in terms of kind of the stated theology of our church would be something along the lines of, we believe that the triune God, through the agency of the Spirit, is present in the creation, but we don't take that final step in believing that individual elements of creation are actually God in and of themselves. So it's God's agency and Spirit in the world that gives life to and renews the creation, but a tree in and of itself is not God. So if that's the line that we can understand, I think that theologically that would be sound. But I think it's very much a fair statement to say that Anglicans do experience God through the beauty of creation. And I wouldn't find it crazy at all to say something like, that the wind today really reminded me of the Spirit blowing in our world, or something like that, so it's that fine line between the actual things being God and God's agency around those things. Yeah?
Sort of hanging on to that. My wife is a cradle Episcopalian, and she said, you can believe in blueberry muffins. Who's going to know? I mean, but along that line, the last week, Dean was talking about Pelagius and Augustine. The economy between the two. Pelagius wanted to take Celtic, very much naturalistic belief, and just put a Christian crown on it, but still believing in their natural belief. Well, I guess Augustine won out as the person whipping himself being so guilty of everything. So what happens then, and what you're seeing is we're in between the two, sort of, but we don't go to either extreme as Anglicans. Is that what you're saying?
Right. So Augustine of Hippo, right? So there's Augustine of Canterbury, there's Augustine, and then there's Augustine of Hippo, like big St. Augustine, city of God. Right. So the early church writings around the same time of Augustine, and I don't know how much this might repeat last week, but there was this, and it was really influenced by the Hellenistic Greek idea about the body and the soul being these separate things, and that's not really biblical, and that's not particularly theological in terms of Christian, but that there was this influence of Hellenism on the early church writings. And so this idea that the body was bad, that the physical, tangible things are bad, and that the soul and the spirit and all of these more ethereal things were good. And so, so in the early church doctrine, that distinction definitely did sort of win out. However, what I think is a really wonderful thing, and I think it does explain how our Celtic heritage as people from the British Isles does continue to influence Anglican theology, is that when, in the 6th century, when the Pope sent emissaries to England to Christianize England, there was very much this idea that instead of crushing these Celtic spirits or these, symbols, that it was, instead of crushing them, to use them and just kind of changed the names so that they would be the names of saints. And that was pretty unique in terms of the way that Christianity in a box kind of got sent out from Rome into different parts of the empire. And in England, it was a unique situation that that underlying layer of Celtic tradition and worship was not extinguished, but it was just translated to give it Christian names. And so we are unique in that respect. So what Paul was talking about with Augustine and Pelagius was a few hundred years before the Christianization of England. But I think that particularity around the order to not just crush all of the Celtic religion, but to use it and translate it into Christianity, or into Christian terms, I do think that that's why that idea of naturalism and, if you will, the balance between the two comes through into our current day theology in a way that it doesn't necessarily in other Western Christian denominations. In the Eastern Church, which didn't have to deal with Pelagius and Augustine in the same way, there were a number of theologians who valued the sort of naturalism and beauty and sacredness of creation, and our theology, I think, much more similarly mirrors that, those writings. Yeah. Sure, right here and then right here.
Okay, so you mentioned that you thought Anglicanism was the only denomination that kind of comes between Catholicism and Reformed Christianity. What do you think about Lutheranism? Do you think that's not quite the same?
Well, Lutheranism is the first of the real Reformed Protestant traditions. And so Lutheranism, I think, is the first, when I would articulate that split, I mean, Lutheranism is the first of the churches on that Reformed Protestant side of that Roman Catholic versus any sort of Protestant. So the Lutheran, this is the 500th anniversary, right, of the Reformation. So in 1517, the nailing of the theses to the door of the cathedral and Luther being excommunicated and all of that was set into motion. At that time, England was still Catholic, and so Henry VIII and then all of the British monarchs after him until Elizabeth, were like 30, 40 years later. And so at the time of Luther, and the rise of Lutheranism and that first kind of Reformed church that broke with Rome, England was still on the side of Rome, and really there's some nuance about later in our once England was not Catholic and became the Church of England, there is some nuance that we did pick up a little bit of the Reformed theology. But we didn't pick up much of it, and most of what we rejected of the Reformation was the reforms of our liturgy. So that's why our liturgy is much more heavily influenced by Roman Catholicism. Some of our theology is certainly more Reformed in comparison to the Roman Catholic Church. But I would say, sorry, this is a really long answer to your question, but I would say Lutheranism is the first of those Protestant Reformed traditions that we're in full communion with the Lutherans. However, we are still, I think, a branch removed in terms of being we are not a fully Reformed church, theologically or liturgically.
Well, I was just thinking there's a big difference between Luther and Calvin, for example.
Sure.
So, it's kind of a spectrum even on the Protestant side.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's certainly a fair statement. Yeah, obviously that within Protestantism there's a huge spectrum, and so yeah, we're much closer to the Lutherans, to some of the Presbyterian theology than we are to later Reformed churches or things that kind of go much further on that spectrum. Yes, absolutely, for sure. But I would just say that Anglican theology is never took that full step towards Reformation. So the English Reformation was just its own little pocket of Reformation history. Yeah, great question. And then we have right here, and then we'll take you.
On the political side,
Right.
the example I would use is the Diocese of San Diego.
Okay.
It's like crumbling right now.
Okay.
Because you've got a fairly Republican, highly Catholic influence.
Okay.
So a lot of churches are like splitting off and leaving, aligning themselves with bishops and the Anglican Church. How is the church dealing with, and the short answer is keeping them not doing the building together, conversation. How's the church as a whole dealing with the people that aren't seeing that majority in that liberal or that more open-minded?
So what I would say about what I said in terms of political is referring to individual, like Anglican ethos around political participation being a part of our call as Christians. The question that you're asking about different churches leaving the Episcopal Church and joining either ACNA or some of the African Anglican churches, I think is so intensely nuanced that I think it would be awesome to have a conversation about that, but I don't know that when I say political, that's not necessarily what I'm touching on. I actually don't know enough about the specifics of what's happening in San Diego, for example, to really even speak a lot to that right there. But I will say that generally, as we've all probably read or heard, if we've heard anything about the Episcopal Church over the last few decades, that it is a fine line between how do we hold a broad framework in terms of political persuasion while maybe our national identity is much more liberal leaning than moderate. I think that's a continuing place of growth for the Episcopal Church. In terms of making sure that people feel welcome regardless of where they fall on the spectrum. I know that doesn't totally answer your question, but it's complicated.
I guess reframing it in the open-mindedness section, how when our open-mindedness is challenged by a black and white perspective, how we as a church respond.
Right.
I guess that would be a better way to.
So when our open-mindedness is challenged by more of a black and white perspective, how are we as a church responding? I think what I would say is in some cases we are responding well, and in some cases we might want to do over. That case by case, church by church, diocese by diocese, I think there are certain ways that conflicts have been handled because of that black and white versus open-mindedness. And I think it's immeasurably complicated. Yeah. Right here.
Getting back to the idea of nature of God, I think it's fair to say that many of the political leaders who founded the country, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, came from Episcopal backgrounds, or I should say Anglican backgrounds.
Right.
But they were largely deists.
Right.
When you dig below the rhetoric. And deism is one of the basic premises is that nature and God are the same.
Right.
So whether you can be Anglican to believe that or not, I don't know. But apparently a lot of really smart people have felt the tension and dealt with it. And I think it's kind of interesting that the Native Americans, at least in New England, looked at it the same way. open-minded, apparently Anglicans as well as other people who've been pulled by the same tension.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. It's really interesting, right, when we, as adults, when we get to study the founding of our country, and much more nuanced than we do, in elementary school or middle school or probably even high school. And when we're confronted with, okay, so the founding fathers, they talk about God, but like, how would they have defined God? What characteristics of God would have been assumptions that our founding fathers would have affirmed or not? What was their practice in terms of attending religious services versus what was the deism, the intellectual, sort of the like non-worshipping intellectual attitude of the founding fathers. So yeah, great point. I think, I don't remember who said it, but I think there is certainly an idea of our church is not going to tell you what you have to think, nor will we know, right? I mean, in the sense of we say the creed collectively so that it covers everyone no matter where they are on their journey with God. Yeah?
Yeah, and to further illustrate the complexity of the human condition on politics, Thomas Jefferson, an Anglican, and the writer of the Declaration of Independence, was about separation of church and state.
Right.
So how we reconcile that concept in our secular government with how we reconcile our faith and our actions as members of the Episcopal Church is, as you say, complex.
Right.
And it's going to be nuanced by each of us as individuals.
Right. Right, and I think it's important for us to both claim this for ourselves and be voices that might talk about that in the world, in the sense that the idea of the founding fathers of the separation of church and state was not so that there would never be voices who were political, the separation between church and state, rather than what I think kind of happens in political discourse today, where we act like, oh, there has to be the separation, so you can't have like an Episcopal students prayer group at a high school. Like that's, you know what I mean? Like that it's understanding the historical nuance and then how that influences us today, I think is also important. But yeah, great point. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think it was intended to protect religion.
Right.
But quickly on aesthetic, I'm trying to wrap my brain around. Can you give a good example? I'm trying to understand what you mean by aesthetic.
Right. So, sorry, my computer just died. So, right. So I had grouped intuitive, or put intuitive and aesthetic sort of next to each other. But this idea that Anglicans believe that beauty in all its fullness is the doorway to goodness and ultimately the doorway to God. Just this idea that, just that aesthetically pleasing things can be avenues towards furthering our relationship, our knowledge of God, which is one of the aspects of how we are maybe not a totally reformed church. A lot of the Reformation threw a lot of the images and a lot of the, I would say, things like that out in terms of seeing that as a way that one might deepen their relationship with God.
So like keeping the sacraments and keeping the singing, things like that, under that domain.
Yeah, I think that, up to your definition of beauty, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we really believe in the incarnational value of like our participation in the sacraments, and that where and how we worship is as important as the fact that we worship. You know, that it is like the space in which we are that we surround ourselves in while we worship, that can open up that experience to God's presence. Yeah. And then I was just gonna say that I know on this chart that just the first three were that idea of moderation and via media, and then the intellectual, and then ambiguity and mystery. So if anyone has questions about those, I know that's not what we're looking at, but I might flip it over. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think it's odd, right? Because I think we're a very traditional church in some ways, and our liturgy is very representative. But I think there's also a certain aspect of creativity to it, and how the church renews itself every 30 or 40 years as we write a new prayer book and we perform our worship. Here at St. Mark's, the last couple Sundays, I think would be Eucharistic prayer is not in the prayer book, but from enriching your worship instead.
Right.
So I wonder if you would think of creativity as being maybe its own kind of separate area, or if it kind of springs from the open-mindedness and the ambiguity of grace.
Sure, yeah. I think, I think creativity could be its own piece of this, or it could fall under that, even not under that aesthetic, though, yeah, it doesn't always go hand in hand. But yeah, absolutely. I think that the idea of open-mindedness, in terms of who we are as Anglicans, definitely allows for the creative work of God, really, to be present among us through our creativity, and a value put on that, and an openness to that. Absolutely. Anyone else? Big questions. Yeah.
Maybe to build on all of this, one of the things that, as I was starting to become a part of this particular faith, that I find so intriguing and love so much is that concept of the three-legged stool and that kind of balance of things. And I'm wondering, how does all of that fit into this? And what's a little bit of the history of that kind of framework?
That hermeneutic.
Yeah.
Sure. So, I don't know what Paul covered last week. Did he talk about that at all?
No, not specific.
Not really, okay. So, right, so there's this hermeneutic, if you will, an Anglican hermeneutic of this three-legged stool, which is scripture, tradition, and reason. That those are the three legs that hold us, I guess, who we are as Anglicans and how we navigate who we are and what we believe. And so this idea that you can't throw out any of those, while we can't throw out any of those while we are crafting our theology, or as our theology, or as our practice, worship, things like that. But as we develop, that we have to hold all three of those in as equal attention as we can. And I really like that. It speaks to, I think, what you asked about, the creativity, this idea that humans are gifted with reason, with intellect, that then the intellectual and creative energy that comes from us is an important part of how we are and who we are and how we develop as a church, as the church. But holding that in tension with our tradition and then with Holy Scripture itself, I think pushes us towards that middle way, and kind of helps hold us apart from any extreme. Yeah.
I'm looking at moderate and open-mindedness.
Right.
Not everyone, including the leaders that be in the Episcopal Church throughout the years, have been all that moderate or all that open-minded. There's been some huge factions of being extreme. Look at how long it took for women to become priests.
Right.
I mean, we have our share of problems. Women to become bishops.
Right.
Bishops who are gay and lesbian.
Right.
Equal marriage. they've all been super problems that we've dealt with, but we've had factions split away from the Episcopal Church.
Right.
People walk out the door.
Right.
Plus, we also had people come back in the door too.
Right.
But if moderation isn't, how do I want to say that? It'd help if you were moderate.
Right. It's an ideal.
But you can go either left or right a little bit.
Sure. Sure. Great point. And very true point, right? That our church collectively and any of us individually are probably never able to live out all of these particular points well at the same time, right? We are who we are as human beings. And so yeah, I think that's a very fair point that throughout the years there have been people that have been more on one side or the other or less open-minded. And I would say though we keep trying, right? And I think the more we can be reminded of this, I mean, I love that when I see in here people who are new to the Episcopal Church, but also people who are lifelong or almost lifelong members of the Episcopal Church. You know, it never hurts to be reminded about kind of at our best who we could be both as individuals and as a church. Good point. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I guess we're done a little early, but thank you. Do you want, if you'd like, to take time and discuss any of this amongst yourselves? Maybe let's do that. Like, try to form little groups, and I certainly know it's harder to speak to a large group than to maybe a small group. So see what you're thinking with the people around you, and maybe we'll do that for a few minutes, and then we'll see if anything comes up from that we'd like to share together. Does that sound okay? Okay. Cool. Yeah, let's do 5 minutes. So we're done on time to get to church.
What channel is that? So
Okay, so as you talk together, what do you come up with? Alright, does anyone want to share anything that came out of their discussion at their table? I'm sure you'd like to continue. I know it's always hard to cut off a good conversation, so I apologize for having to be a stickler about time. But yeah, what came up as you wondered together or talked together about what we've been talking about, or maybe about other things too? Yeah.
We kind of came up with this idea of togetherness or community as being kind of enables this moderation and so on. The fact that you can go and practice your belief in blueberry muffins,
Right.
but you still come together every Sunday and have some core beliefs there.
Yeah, I like that relationship as key. Nice. Anyone else?
Well, I'm a 61-year-old gay male that was raised Catholic, has always been Catholic, and the draw was, I mean, I feel like family, and I've only been coming a few months, and the open-mindedness and is like amazing, just amazing. I don't have to feel like I have to get up and leave during the sermon. So.
Like small victories.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can set the bar a little higher going forward. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
We were saying that it's important that that minorities and same-sex couples are in visible positions, and that they're seen in leadership rather than just having this ambiguity. Yes, you're welcome. you know, they need to be out there to reflect society. And it's maddening that the Episcopal Church is so slow in adopting this reality.
Can you tell me more about what you mean in terms of slow, or what?
Well, so for example, I saw 2 movies this week. One was Beauty and the Beast, and it's the new Disney movie. And it was very well done, but what I noticed is among the dancers, it was a kaleidoscope of people of all types. They had a gay couple dancing at one point, and this is a kids movie.
Okay.
So, and then I saw another movie, Sully, which is directed by Clint Eastwood, and it seemed like all the people on the task board that were investigating his landing were white. Predominantly, everyone around was white, and maybe that's true in Minnesota, but New York, it's certainly not true where the movie was taking place. So I thought that there was either intentional exclusion or just a lack of awareness of what the world is like. And I would have to say the Episcopal Church lacks that too.
Fair. Thanks for that. Anyone else? Yeah.
It's interesting, just to that point, because I'm reading this feminist who's talking about, do we want women in positions of leadership in the church to uphold the patriarchy or to change the church? Right? That if you become, if you're representing a minority or a marginalized group or a typically oppressed group, are you then promoted and moved through and become a leader to then promote the church that has kind of ongoingly, or religious group, right? This actually happened to be a Jewish writer, but thinking about this, like, what's the role in the community and what do we really, really, really want, right? And so do we really, really want women who are then upholding the patriarchy and kind of saying the same rhetoric, or, do we want same-sex couples, or do we want people of color who are then basically representing the white message, right? Or do we want them doing something new as our leaders, right? Like, what are we genuinely asking and what are we genuinely changing? And I find it a fascinating slow. I mean, the thing about the Anglican vision is that it's just it's slow to move and it's slow to change, and that we kind of all agree that's okay. But I thought, oh yeah, that's different, right? Than just, oh, we want these people represented in leadership. No, do we want our vision as a church to then, or as a community, our message to change? That is change in leadership. And I thought, oh, she's really getting in, she's really deep in there, right?
Well, and I think not only do we want our message or the way that people participate in leadership, to me it's not only a question of do we really want that, but even if we say we want that, are we really prepared for that, right? And then are we, and this is such a big conversation, but how are we called now to account for, if we are called now, how are we called to account for or be willing to change some of our systems which historically have continued to kind of, reinforce the status quo in terms of the patriarchy, or in terms of our church being at least in the Episcopal Church in the United States, a white church, or as Anglicanism spread throughout the world, a colonial church. I think we are in this position right now as a church where we are wondering if we are called to face up to some of those historical realities and how are we maybe called to listen to the Spirit's discernment with us about then how we might go forward, which is a little bit different than what you're saying, but I think it all is part of this this big question about like who is the church called to be going forward that might be different from how we've looked in the past. Yeah, great. All right, anything else? Maybe one more and then we can wrap up. Not, we're good. Yeah.
This is in my own personal, like, I went on at a couple of years ago where we celebrated this discovery. Well, the Indians discovered Columbus on a Native American tour. It was led by a Native American.
Oh, okay.
And actually, I went up to him and apologized because my great-great-grandfather settled in Minnesota, taking him to Indian land. And I just realized that I actually need to reconcile that part of our and then also recently there was a men's group that was a Native American. Told my grandfather something.
Great. Well, and that's, I think, a beautiful point to end on, that ultimately this is a guide, and though we are called to, I think, all respond to whatever that way the Spirit nudges us in terms of how we are reconciled in a relationship and continue to be in a relationship. So yeah, thank you. Well, thank you all very much. I hope these conversations continue. Enjoy worship if you are going, and enjoy the rest of your day if you are not.